Once upon a midnight dreary,
while I ponder weak and weary
over many a quaint and curious volume
of forgotten lore.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tap.
rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor.
Internationally lauded poet. Poe! Edgar Allan Poe! Does it ring a bell? A drink to any man in this room who can finish this line! Quote the Raven! Piss off! How's this?
He was an alcoholic.
He's a drunk. He's a drunk. He's a lunatic. He's like wandering the streets.
Stop. Cut. I hate to be the one to tell you this, but everything you know about Edgar Allan Poe is wrong. We've got some work to do. Seriously, let's go. Someone, take this shit off me. Take it off. All right, that's better. Oh. Edgar Allan Poe. Not only one of the greatest writers of all time, he is also one of the most influential. And I don't mean that in a wonky or professorial sense. Literally, many of the stories, TV shows, or movies you like come from Poe's innovations. But despite all of his accomplishments, this caricature of Poe as a consummately depressed, mentally unstable, drunken drug addict still persists today. So let's address the myth and get a bit closer to the real Edgar Allan Poe. Poe is perhaps most widely known for his Gothic tales. They are designed to unnerve and terrify readers, but he actually began as a love poet, and most of his love poems do not involve death. If we look at most of his writing, it's literary criticism, essentially reviewing works from other authors. And that may not interest us much today, but keep in mind he was of the generation forging a national literature for a fairly new nation. While his contemporaries were willing to praise anything from an American author, he argued that critics had to be tough on creative works in order to establish a respectable national literature. Now, he only lived to the age of 40. But in that time, he wrote over 70 short stories, but only 12 of those are horror stories. 1/3 of them are actually romantic comedies. Others are science fiction and detective fiction. One of his final works is a treatise that attempts to describe the origins of the universe and employ thinking akin to what would become Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum physics. That's amazing. Poe experienced a great deal of tragedy in his lifetime. He was orphaned at the age of 2. He had a horrible relationship with his adoptive father. He watched many of the women he loved die slowly of tuberculosis, and most of his adult life was riddled with financial instability. In other words, he was like many 19th century Americans. It is true that he married his first cousin when she was only 13 years old, and he was in his mid-20s. The cousin thing wasn't so strange at the time, but the age difference raised some eyebrows. Keep in mind, his marriage fomented a strong family unit between Virginia Clem, her mother, and Poe. It was the first time in his life where he was surrounded by people who not only loved him, but believed in him. He did fight bouts of melancholy, and on one occasion tried to take his own life after his wife died. But Poe also wrote his most famous and darkest stories to appeal to what sold at the time, just like J.K. Rowling did with Harry Potter, or Stephanie Meyer did with Twilight. And in order to profit further from these works, he created a dark caricature of himself when he gave readings. So Poe would captivate his audiences with this brooding persona, but then go home and play the flute with his wife Virginia, who played the piano, and her mother sang. It was hardly an image of the Lord of Darkness. So what do we know about his habits? Well, he drank and ruined some relationships under the influence of alcohol. But after 1 or 2 glasses of wine, he would become drunk and have a hangover for days. Hardly the track record of a raging alcoholic. Many people also associate Poe with using opium, and plenty of his contemporaries were using hallucinogenic drugs for artistic inspiration. There's no indication he used opium as an intoxicant. Even his doctor said Poe did not use it recreationally. And in terms of his mental health, it's important to note that for all his interest in madness and murder, his writing style is steeped in the rational and the powers of logic. Anytime someone frames Poe as a crazy drunk, I wonder, have you actually read his works? In Poe's writing, we see his mental faculties are sharp, even as he probes the underpinnings of madness and murder. So where did all this misreading of Poe's life come from? Largely from the final mystery he left for us, his death. On September 27, 1849, Poe travels from Richmond to Baltimore, where he is going to change trains and head to Philadelphia. But after stepping off the train in Baltimore, he disappears for several days. Then he's found in a gutter, wearing someone else's clothes, muttering nonsense. He's taken to a hospital where he goes in and out of consciousness and dies a few days later. Since then, historians, biographers, physicians, criminologists, almost every walk of discipline has attempted to determine the cause of his death. Here are some of the theories. Most likely, we will never know the answer. What we do know is that after he died, Rufus Griswold, who definitely had an axe to grind against Poe, took the opportunity to slander Poe, calling him a drunk, an addict, a loner. And Maria Clem, his aunt, tried to come to his defense, but she was a woman, so no one really listened to her. It ends up that an envious literary rival established many of the biographical myths about Poe that persist to this day. Despite all of that, Poe accomplished what Griswold desperately wanted for himself, a legacy that lasted long after his death. Of course, that legacy was not immediate. Surely with the international fame of his poem, The Raven, American readers recognized the genius that had sprung from this nation, right? Not really. Poe made a lot of enemies among literary circles. While people enjoyed his readings, he was also mocked. Countless parodies of The Raven were published. It seemed at the time of his death, he was a one-hit wonder. Enter the French. In 1847, the French poet Charles Baudelaire introduced Poe to French readers through his translation. He called Poe his long-lost brother and berated Americans for not fully acknowledging the genius of Poe. French poets, novelists, artists took to Poe's works, exploring them, contemplating them, and using them as an inspiration. This fascination made its way to Britain. In fact, if you have ever read or watched the films Sherlock Holmes, you can thank Poe. The British author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Sherlock Holmes, outrightly admitted he ripped off the character from Poe's detective character Dupin. 70 years later, after Poe's death, the American-born but British emigre poet T.S. Eliot, along with the American poet William Carlos Williams, revive and defend Poe's place in the American literary canon. They were both influenced by Baudelaire. So it's likely without the French, Poe would have been relegated to the fate of most writers, sitting at the bottom of one of those big bins of books you see at the grocery store for $5. So depressing. But instead we have Poe museums up and down the East Coast. There is the Poe Society, Poe Awards for writing. So how did any of this influence what you read or watch today? Take any detective story, from CSI to House or certainly Sherlock Holmes. Poe invented this genre. The inept band of authorities are aided by a detective who, through his uncanny powers of deduction, solves the seemingly unsolvable mystery.
Elementary, my dear Watson. This man has been dead for at least 2 hours.
Or how about science fiction? Star Trek, Star Wars, Dune? The idea that a writer would contemplate on the page the innovations that ultimately come to be true is at the heart of several of Poe's works. And lastly, about those Gothic tales. Well, those are important because Poe, unlike his peers, rejected the idea that a writer had an obligation to affirm a moral code. He argued a story only needs to entertain. Countless horror and thriller movies tread a similar line, where the main character is not a good person and will not be redeemed. The goal is about effect, that's it. We don't go see a horror film to affirm our ethical compass. We go to get the shit scared out of us.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Poe showed how creating an experience in itself is art. Art for art's sake, without apology. So what would Poe think of all the dark, Gothic elements surrounding his legacy? Well, Poe embraced the fun and Gothic, darkness and unknown and terrifying, but he also wanted us to know how smart he was, that his intellectual prowess was perhaps one of the greatest of his day. Consider this. In one of his most famous stories, The Fall of the House of Usher, he establishes the house as a model of the mind, and in entering the house, and in entering the story, we go deeper and deeper into the conscience and subconscious. Psychoanalysis before Freud, dream theory before Inception. Poe was more than a great writer. He was one of the best minds of his generation, which is why we keep coming back time and time again to find in these stories what lies beneath. What does he teach us about the full range of the human experience, even the unspeakable ones? The beautiful and the terrible, the wisdom and the madness, the decay and the wondrous, all bound together in a single page, in a single moment. That is the real Edgar Allan Poe. Now, how about some more of those dancing bats? Let's hit it.
It is a very favorite poem.
Vive la France!
Pretty good, huh?